Barry Harris uses a biblical analogy to describe how Western harmony creates chords and scales. He says that in the beginning, God created the world. He says the world is the chromatic scale. And after God creates the world, he creates man and woman. Man and woman are the whole tone scales. So two notes, two scales where each note is separated by a whole tone. Then he says that man and woman have children. These become the three diminished chords. Each one of these diminished chords takes two notes from each whole tone scale. These two come from one whole tone scale, these two come from the other. Each diminished chord is formed the same way. Now what does he say? When man and woman have children, the children branch out. Let's take this diminished chord. It's going to start branching out. How do they branch out? They lower one note or raise it. We'll just look at lowering for now. As we lower one note, we form dominants. Now if we take those roots of those four dominants, play them together with that diminished chord we started with, that's the diminished scale. Taking these three diminished chords and going further, this is how we create our important chords and scales. The first scale that Barry Harris talks about is the major sixth diminished scale. It's going to look like either a bebop scale, major bebop scale, or a major scale with an added note, depending on how you look at it. But what's really going on there? Let's break that down. Two things to note. First thing is that it's made up of two chords. A major sixth chord and a diminished chord. If I play these in inversions, the scale may be played that way. Another way to look at it though, even further, going even deeper into it, is that a major sixth chord is actually made up of two diminished chords. These two notes come from one diminished, these two notes come from the other diminished, and one is missing. The one that's missing, right here. So you can see how this scale right here is formed from two chords, the major sixth diminished, or the major sixth and the diminished chord. It's further can be justified that it is made up of the three diminished chords. All three contribute to making this scale. There are three other scales that he uses. The minor sixth diminished, the dominant seven diminished, and the dominant seven flat five diminished. This is a good time to move forward. That's the brief overview and introduction. I'll go a little bit deeper into the theory and into these scales, if you want to stick around. Now we're going to look at the minor sixth diminished scale. Here we have these three notes coming from one diminished, this note coming from the other diminished, the one that's missing, right here. Okay, now the next one, dominant seven diminished. Okay, dominant seven flat five diminished. Sorry, looking at the dominant seven first. These three come from one diminished. This one comes from the other diminished. The one that's missing, right here. Alright, Alright, now looking at the dominant 7 flat 5. These two come from one diminished. These two come from the other diminished. And this is the one that's missing. We're going to put that in between. My mistake. Alright. The reason why I like this is every scale that we use now, including the major and minor scales, they're justified. They all come back to the chromatic scale. They all go back to where we started. There's much more to get into here. We're still only scratching the surface. But I appreciate that it's a justified method. I appreciate that everything is anchored back to some fundamental concepts. That our chords, that everything we do is derived from diminished. That everything we do with scales and chords that we recognize, all of our progressions, all of our harmonies, come back to the diminished chords, which come back to the whole tone scales, which comes back to the chromatic scale, which is how we divide the spectrum of sound in Western harmony. To me, everything is justified. Everything has a reason. The implications of this are so broad. There's so much you can do with these scales, and there's no way in a short video that we'll be able to get through it all. But it begins to hint at why this method is so important and why this method is so useful, and why so many people turn to it. To me, just nothing about music theory is arbitrary anymore. Everything comes back to the chromatic scale. Everything runs through the diminished.